Hey, how's it going, everybody? Jesse Montano and Meghan Angley out here at the Avs practice facility. Just got done hearing from Joe Sakic, Chris MacFarland. We're going to unpack everything that we just heard on today's show, but I do want to remind you guys about our great friends over at Trusted American Mortgage. Head on over to trustedamerican.com right now. Their salary-based mortgage consultants want to help you lower your interest rate, get a better monthly payment. So like I said, go to trustedamerican.com right now to see how much money they can help you start saving today. Hello and welcome in.
Please do not leave your luggage unattended on the station.
Welcome to the show. Hey, how's it going, everybody? Welcome in. Jesse Montano, Meghan Angley. Emotional is not the right word, but Meghan, we just had our season-ending availability with Joe Sakic and Chris MacFarland. Chris MacFarland, general manager of the Colorado Avalanche. Joe Sakic, president of the organization. A lot of tough questions, a lot of tough answers, and I thought that was one of the more raw and honest availabilities that we've gotten out of Chris MacFarland, Joe Sakic on the heels of that round one elimination. We're going to dig into all of it. We'll hear from them a little bit. As always, let's start. How you doing?
I'm doing good. You probably noticed I came in right up the line there, right before Chris and Joe walked in the room. So there was a little bit of that stress, gripping the steering wheel a little tightly getting here in the rain, but I'm so much better now that I made it.
Meghan just likes to feel something. So she likes to get that adrenaline going. So she makes sure she runs right up to the last second just to feel alive.
Yeah.
Meghan, I guess there's not much for us to pontificate about here. Let's just kind of jump right into things, what we heard. Today, look, you and I have already had a couple shows where we talked about and unpacked what happened not only in Game 7, but in the Round 1 series in general against the Dallas Stars. And today we got to hear from C-Mac and Joe on it as well. But everything started confirming the thing that we thought would happen. Look, you and I both said, I don't think C-Mac loses his job. I don't think Jared Bednar loses his job. But there probably is going to be a head that rolls. And we both said, if anybody, it's likely Ray Bennett, power play coach. And that is how Chris MacFarland started the availability. Ray Bennett has been relieved of his coaching duties as of this morning.
Today we made a difficult decision. We're going to move on a good hockey man and a good person and a good coach in Ray Bennett. So just wanted to start off with that and thank Ray for many, many years of 100% commitment to us. Ray's been around a long time, and that was not an easy start to the day. So
I can't say it's fully unexpected, but I guess just what were your thoughts when this presser started and now is how it leads off?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's tough. I think I was actually on his, coach page the other night to try and see when he first started here and if it had any contract information for his term. And I was just looking over some of his past numbers with the power play over the seasons in his time with the Avs. And on the whole, it's come away very good. And so special teams in season especially, they come in waves. And so you have those moments where it hits a low and you really feel the stagnancy of it and it's frustrating. But you come away and it's like, this was a top 10 power play in the league year by year, right? But what became an issue was those lows did still persist every season. And look, there's going to be fluctuations on the power play no matter what. But the timeliness of them in this series is where it became an issue. It's like, okay, this can't happen right now. You need to find a path forward because they have 2 overtime periods. They lose where they start with some amount of time with the man advantage. And similarly, there's 2 double minor opportunities in this series that they're not able to capitalize on. And so in seeing how thin the margins were at the end of the day, because look, the team did struggle to execute 5v5 too. And that's addressed later in the press conference too. But ultimately, when you look at the timing of the inability to capitalize on power plays and Dallas's ability to capitalize on theirs, you do come away with that being a huge factor in the series. And with the talent that's on the power play, I talked about it pretty authentically in the post-game, a lot of raw emotion behind it, but it's true with that talent on the power play, no matter what the aggressive Dallas PK is doing, there should have been more options. And it's a complicated conversation with some layers because the players have a say in it too, and they have a job to do to execute similarly. But it just didn't feel like, I use the word versatility a lot, some of versatility is the players innately having that, and it's also being shown other options. And I just didn't feel they had enough.
Joe Sakic, I mean, he didn't say it's Ray Bennett's fault, but he was pretty clear in his thoughts that he felt Dallas's ability to convert on not only power plays, but key power plays at key moments, in the Avs' inability to do so. To your point, not even necessarily the power play as a whole, but the power plays in overtime, the double minors, the opportunities that they had to extend leads late in games with the man advantage. Joe Sakic, I thought, was pretty clear in how he felt that cost them the series.
5-on-5, I thought we played great hockey. Prepared, and the guys were dialed in, and we were playing Avalanche hockey. I think the difference in the series, when you look back and reflect, is their power play. They executed. They did everything they needed to do to be dangerous and scored at key moments of the game, and our power play didn't do that. For whatever reason, whether it was it ended up being confidence, I think, but try and make adjustments, but we just we didn't have it at the right time, and so that at the end of the day, that when you look at it all, that was the difference.
And like you said, it was that inability to find a way to make it work, to make a small little, I don't even necessarily know if it's adjustment or a new rollout of how you want to deploy guys, whatever it is.
Right.
Joe Sakic, I thought, made it pretty clear, like, yeah, our inability to find one more power play to capitalize on is ultimately what cost us this series. And again, he didn't say it's Ray Bennett's fault. He made the exact point that you did. At a certain level, the players have to execute, but they just felt like maybe there wasn't enough done in those finer-tuned moments. And so that's why ultimately it's not a huge surprise. You're going to get a fresh voice in there. And I just want to make one last comment on your point about, like, lulls happen. But, man, it did feel like, and this isn't exclusive to this season, Megan, where, like,
No.
you had extended lulls over and over and over again. And then you go through stretches where it was white hot. And that, after a while, it's just like, okay, so we're just constantly on this hot or cold. And what happens if a cold strikes at the wrong time? And that's kind of what happened. And that's why I think Ray Bennett finds himself on the open market today.
And I go back to this in season this year, leading up to the Mikko trade. And I said this adamantly, Mikko Rantanen was not the problem on the power play or on the whole with the scoring, but the scoring was down over a 20-game stretch around Christmas into mid-January, just ahead of the Mikko Rantanen trade. And really the scoring was down within the depth. And so that's why, too, there's that urgency around we need more depth on this team. All of our goals are coming from the same 5 guys. But similarly, those top 5 guys are not converting on the power play. And since the goals are down on the whole, we really need that right now in season, right? Like, they're still battling in a very difficult division. And so I can't help but feel like this does extend well beyond this playoff series, though the timeliness of it in series probably was the nail in coffin. The issues in series did sort of lead up to kind of big turnover and change. And again, it's not squarely because Mikko Rantanen was a part of that. It was more so they couldn't agree to a contract and they needed to improve their depth, blah, blah, blah. Everyone knows that story. But I do think the timing of the power play struggling and going a bit stagnant ahead of the Mikko Rantanen trade is an important part of that conversation too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're going to get into the Mikko stuff. That was touched on a lot today. By Joe Sakic, Chris MacFarland. But let's go from Ray Bennett to Jared Bednar. And there's really not much to say here, Megan. I asked them what the organization, and before I could even finish the question, Chris MacFarland sat up in his seat and got close to the microphone.
For either one of you guys, talking to the players after the game, it still seems like they still have a strong connection with Jared Bednar. I guess just where are you guys at? Where's the organization at confidence-wise in Jared's ability to lead this group?
100% confident Jared's our head coach.
Didn't leave any room for gray, no interpretation. Jared Bednar will be back behind the bench next year.
Yeah, I had a note in here. Well, one, he's won at every level. I've seen a lot of discourse around Jared Bednar and inheriting such a stacked team in the 2022 season that you didn't really need a coach necessarily to bring them to that win because of how deep and well-constructed that team was. And I want to push back against that narrative because of...
That's a crazy narrative. Anybody that's saying that has no idea what they're talking about.
This is a coach who's won at every level, and so that doesn't account for the context of all of those teams and the team that he inherited in the 48-point season, bringing them to that point. And that required some of these core players, just entering the league and sort of getting adjusted to the league and becoming more impactful players too. So like Nathan MacKinnon is a huge part of that conversation growing up in the league in addition to that. But the other thing I was going to point out, because I keep referencing this 20-game stretch, right, from Christmas, and I marked it from Christmas to 124, which is when the Mikko Rantanen trade happened. They were 19th in the league for goals for. And Jared Bednar, kind of following the Mikko trade, when he's observing that even with the addition of Netchis and Drury, they're still digging themselves out of a little bit of a lack of goal-scoring hole. And so he's talking about this project around the Four Nations break, that he wants to get more out of all of his lineup. And so this was still happening a little bit, even when Netchis and Drury entered the picture. By the March deadline, day of, so this is before Brock Nelson and Charlie Coyle can come and help this team, they're 8th in the league in goals for. This project that Jared Bednar dug into, you started to get more depth contributions from players like Parker Kelly, Logan O'Connor, Jack Drury stepping up. And I kind of want to point out that we might not, have the tactical reasons in front of us right now, but there was success coming out of the Four Nations break immediately following this project. And so those returns, I think, shouldn't be understated or taken away, the credit that Jared Bednar has over the differences in how his team created coming out of the break. And some of that was they did need depth options. And the other thing is the success of the fourth line. There is such a strength in Jared Bednar as a coach with working with that type of line, those type of players. He can really get the most out of them. And so I don't think it's by accident that that fourth line comes together and becomes sort of this most consistent line. And Jack Drury comes and he's immediately putting up some points. It's nothing crazy. It's not Martin Netchis numbers, but I think some of the success that they started to find in depth scoring, obviously Charlie Coyle coming in helped that bottom line. They were in this place at the end of the year, too, where they had a rotation of capable guys that could slot in, and that's before Landeskog enters the conversation, right? And so I think the success of, one, getting so many new players acclimated in season, right? This becomes a slightly different conversation in the series specifically. You look at a coach to be the guy who's steadying that ship. And it's hard to get the guys at the top of the lineup on board, but as well as the depth. And I think that deserved more credit, especially just shouting out that Four Nations project that he dug into than it got. And it's not exclusive to this season that we see Jared Bednar get more out of his players. The way that Val Nichushkin has been utilized since getting here, a lot was demanded of him, but it made him into a more responsible player. Dallas doesn't recognize the version of Val Nichushkin that exists in Colorado. Arturi Lehkonen, a career year in goals, coming to Colorado, utilized in a different way in Bednar's system. A lot of it already complements the things that Lehkonen does well, but also there's something to be said for Jared Bednar getting a lot more out of his players. So it's not just the depthy guys that I'm talking about, it's the top of the lineup too. And there's a rapport between him and MacKinnon that I think it gets talked about all different kinds of ways. But I think it's something you don't want to take for granted. You bring in a new coach, the respect that they have for each other is, one, built over time. There's a foundation that exists between them, and it's not easily found. We saw the way in which a MacKinnon and Patrick Waugh didn't necessarily work. They weren't necessarily compatible. Bednar finding a line of communication with a player like MacKinnon who can be a bit cantankerous is something I also want to shout out that you don't want to take for granted. The grass isn't always greener on the other side.
Yeah, all right, you made a lot of points there, and I think I can basically sum it up into, it's not about the last 7 games when you're making a decision of that magnitude on a head coach. There's so many things that you just listed off there about going all the way back to the 2016, 2017, and I have to say this before I keep going. When you're talking about people saying, oh, he inherited the 2022. No, he inherited the 2016 team. That's what 17?
It was 2016, 2017.
Okay, all right, thank you. Yeah. But that's the team that Jared Bednar inherited. Everything past that, he's part of building. And again, I think that's the point that you're talking about. There's countless examples over the last 8-9 years, whatever it's been, where to me that's how you judge that this is the right guy for this job. And you've seen him take them to the Stanley Cup final. His message resonates with the top players in the dressing room. And again, something that when you're talking about moving on from a coach, I think that's usually when it's like, hey, the message isn't resonating anymore. What he's saying isn't landing with the group. It's no longer getting the best out of the players. It's no longer elevating, using your examples. Guys like Val Nichushkin, Arturi Lehkonen, guys are no longer coming in here and thriving. Guys are kind of stalling out. Players that have been here aren't growing anymore. And then on top of that, we can't get over this hump and, that we're not seeing the growth. I just don't think that's the case with Jared Bednar. I think it's fair to criticize the results in the last 3 postseasons. They haven't gotten out of the second round. Again, that is totally fair. And if you want to put a share of that blame on the head coach, I'm sure Jared Bednar takes a share of that blame himself. But to the many great points that you just made, where I'm going with this is, you don't make rash decisions like that when you're dealing in pro sports. We lost, it's emotional, I'm upset, we're moving on. No, you've got to say, are the players still responding to this guy? Are we still more or less getting the results? Are we seeing players improve? Are we seeing growth within our lineup? Are we seeing young players like Sam Malinsky coming in and growing their game to that next level? And if your answer to the vast majority of those questions is yes, look, I do think there is, there eventually does come a time where you say, it's a what have you done for me lately? We haven't gotten the results. We're going to move on. But for a head coach who's been here, has had the success, has led your team on one of their more successful regular season runs across multiple seasons in franchise history, a guy who gets the most out of your players, a guy who, to your point, works really well with your superstar player who can be a little prickly. Those things outweigh the fact that you pulled a really good team in the first round and lost a heartbreaker in 7 games to me.
Yeah, I think about Zach Parise last year talking about Jared Bednar providing his players a roadmap to win. Talking with Brock Nelson, he described something similar in the information that's given to them in series and how much more in-depth it gets. Because I think the criticism in this series was the DeBoer comparison. Side by side, it felt like he's getting out-coached. And so what's tough is I think people feel he didn't make any tactical changes in response to Dallas, but that isn't true. And as we've talked about it over the series, we've talked about the way in which he's changed some of the lines. But beyond that, he has given them different ways to break out, because that was an area of Colorado's game that Dallas was picking apart. And so the D-to-D pass sometimes didn't work. And so they would have, on the breakout, they'd have a forward hang back as caution, and they would sometimes utilize the forward more on the breakout. And this would allow them to more safely, but also more efficiently attack with speed. And similarly, their entries changed too. There was a variety of ways in which they entered. Earlier in the series, they'd have the skater get across the blue line and dump the puck in, and then they'd have F1 go below it to collect that puck, and F1 then would go to kind of the half wall to get that puck back from the one battle, which was a 50-50 win because Dallas was also pretty quick to try to get below the goal line with numbers to smother that guy, but they also then realized that Dallas is probably going to beat them to that puck below, Colorado's probably going to beat them to that puck below the goal line. They just have the speed to do it. So they would actually turn their attention to the guy at the half wall, that F1, right? And so that pass would come back initially. On entry, they would seem to have possession, right? But then the guy on the wall would be smothered. He'd be suffocated because they would turn their attentions to him instead of worrying about that race. And then that's where the Avs would get clipped to the perimeter, and it would make it hard for them to get anything inside ice. And similarly, the guy out high, like a Cale Makar, they had his number too. And so the tactical changes were not necessarily the dump and chase style of hockey. They would get that initial pass back quicker coming over the blue line in a way similar that we saw with like the Brock, it was Gabriel Landeskog, Brock Nelson, and I want to say Val Nichushkin was the other player. And that's the one that takes kind of a weird trajectory to the net in the series. But that type of entry is an example of overcoming a way in which Dallas was sort of countering that. I don't want to call it dump and chase, but a lot of this Dallas wanted to beat Colorado into kind of a muck and grind style of hockey, and Colorado was good at coming up with a win in that initial puck battle, but it could be hard for winning the puck back after that. And so I think that's just one example that comes to mind of a change that was made. But there are areas where changes weren't made. That's on the power play. And so that is where there is that frustration that creeps in, and I shouldn't say that. There were some changes to the power play over the course of the series, but it felt like they would revert back to old habits and they would get stuck in that aggressive kill from Dallas, unable to find any seams, just moving the puck around. So it might be tape-to-tape passes, but it's one too many because they can't find a lane to the net. And that's where you felt the frustration on the power play side of it. But you look at why they dominated 5v5, and there's a lot of Jared Bednar's fingerprints as to why that is.
Well, and yeah, like I said, that's why you can't just take what happened in these 7 games and apply it as that's what we're going to go off of to hire or fire guys. Let's move on, Megan. Joe Sakic, I thought had a lot of really interesting quotes in this one, but obviously Mikko Rantanen was a big topic of discussion, and they pretty vehemently continued to defend the move. I did ask later in the press conference about Carolina then flipping him back to Dallas, and they didn't really take the bait on that. Hey, there's nothing we can do about it. But Joe Sakic said, yeah, we would do it again. We felt that was the right move for our team, and they hammered on it multiple times. Chris MacFarland even saying, when we met for our winter meetings, our team was not good enough. And that was a phrase that they used over and over again. We weren't good enough. We weren't deep enough. We weren't good enough. We needed a team more similar to what we had in 2022. Joe Sakic acknowledged, yes, we had our stars in 2022, but it was the depth. It was our ability to come at you in waves. I know it didn't have anything to do with the Mikko Rantanen deal, but they, talked about how they liked what they did in net. They defended making the Mikko Rantanen trade and said, essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, we did what we felt was going to make us the best version of our team, and it really sucks that it didn't work out. Joe Sakic even said, if it was up to me, I'd run it back with this group again next year. We think that highly of this group. So, we knew they weren't going to come out and be like, oh, man, what a mistake it was to trade Mikko Rantanen. But they said, yeah, we would do it again.
Yeah, I think one thing Joe Sakic said early in the press conference that he kind of stopped, thought more about how he was saying it and kind of changed direction was how the conversations with Mikko's agent went. He said something about, how, Mikko's agent has his idea of what that number was, and the way he said it sounded as if, look, there's a lot of numbers out there about what Mikko wanted and where that line was drawn on the Av side, on Mikko's side, and I just don't think we've ever been given the full story. I think that's an important part here.
Yeah, and we never will. Totally.
And we never will, but it sounded like Joe was almost about to say as much. What we hear in the public-facing side of things, it's being fed to us. That's one interpretation of it, right? Is kind of the impression I got of how he was saying it. I think that's important, that this was just not going to work with Mikko. He was going to walk into free agency, and the team would not be deep, and so they might get, a playoff performer in Mikko for one more run here, but they still wouldn't have had the depth. They would have, the depth would have honestly been a huge issue. Because look, something we'll talk about at some point over, our breakdowns over the summer is how this third line was kind of ineffective in this series. It didn't come together in the right way. So it's still a problem that's looming over the Avs' head. But imagine the problem, that's with the addition of a Coyle and a Landeskog coming back, and then you've got a fourth line that's only made up of Jack Drury as the center there, who was a beast in the faceoff dot all series long. You wouldn't have had these things. You wouldn't have had a bottom six, essentially.
Well, and not to mention that, Megan, but had you kept Mikko, right, and we're seeing it with Toronto right now, in a little bit of a different circumstance with Mitch Marner, okay, let's say you would have kept Mikko. And you would have had at least a version of the issues that you just laid out regarding the depth. Even if, and I'm even being maybe a little bit overly generous here. Let's say you could have brought in Charlie Coyle still, and I'm kind of just making shit up here.
Yeah.
So let's say you're able to make a tweak. You keep Mikko. You can't get him signed yet, and now and you lose in the first round of the Dallas Stars. That's likely who you would have played either way. So then you would have been sitting here on May 6th, and we would have been talking to these guys saying, are you worried about being able to get a deal done for Mikko? What's going to happen? And then imagine the questions that you have to face if he ends up walking in free agency and signs with Dallas this summer. Then you got nothing for him. He signed in your division because clearly that was a place he was comfortable signing. They would have pursued him in the offseason had he gotten to free agency. You were really in a tough spot, shy of just giving in to the number that Joe Sakic's alluding to, whatever the version of the number is that Mikko and his agent feel that it is. And so, I give him credit for saying we made the move that we felt was the best thing for our organization, and we're sticking by it.
And let's not forget, too, there was a huge issue at 2C. And look, this hasn't aged well when we look at Brock Nelson's offensive impact in the series, but Casey Middelstadt would not have been the solution going into these playoffs. I think everyone watching the season would have felt a confidence saying, yeah, that wouldn't have been the move. And so the Mikko Rantanen trade is sort of a catalyst in being able to better address that position as well. Obviously, Charlie Coyle is a return in moving on from Casey Middelstadt, and it would have still presented a huge issue with 2C in addition to the depth issue that was also there. So there are big issues with the roster that needed to be addressed, and I'm not saying that's why the Mikko Rantanen trade happened. It's just a product of that.
I should mention they did say no other personnel changes are expected. Hockey ops, coaching, things like that. But they definitely did say they've got their work cut out for them in terms of how the roster's put together. That's not exactly the words they used, but hey, we got clarity on Gabe. We'd like to run it back in the best way that we can, but we know we're gonna have to go through our exit interviews, things like that. I guess did you have any thoughts on? I stand by what I said yesterday. It's gonna be tough for him, but I think those looked like two guys in there that were pissed off, that were motivated, and I think they're going to be aggressive this summer in making sure this roster is where they want it to be going into next year.
Yeah, there's a lot of motivation behind that, too. It's how close this team came to getting it done, but also how much they gave up to make it all possible. Yep. And so some of the work to be done is where can we pour back into the future of this window? Because right now there have been so many changes to the immediate to affect this window. And obviously we didn't get outside of the first round, so that's a problem, right? And they're going to need to then have an interesting strategy for how they approach free agency, college free agents, as well as the draft. And I'm not expecting them necessarily to draft players that can make an impact in the NHL out of this draft, but it's usually where they recoup some picks, and they've had some interesting late round picks as of late that I think that will be an interesting thing to keep an eye on. And the other thing is, you're right, there were so many different questions with the same answers about how much this stings, basically. Yeah. And I think that the answer to my Mackenzie Blackwood question was interesting, right? Is one, they feel they've only scratched the surface in getting the most out of Mackenzie Blackwood as a starter. And I share in that sentiment. Yep. I've seen some people critical of the term that they signed him to before having seen him play in the playoffs. After they saw him play in the playoffs, they're like, wow, can't believe that we're locked into this goaltender for the next few years. I can't believe that. I think that Mackenzie Blackwood really proved himself in the series, but also over his body of work in the regular season. And Joe Sakic's answer to following, Chris MacFarland's thoughts that he's only scratched the surface was really going back to with how good Blackwood was, how solid he was, how much confidence he gave the team. That's another reason why this stings. Look how good this team was. Mm-hmm. Just look at how good this goaltender was, and that adds to the sting. And I can appreciate that because there's optimism then around where they're still headed with a player like Blackwood, who is going to be their starter for years to come.
Yeah, and those were two areas where Joe Sakic even said, look, you want a positive out of all this? We got our captain back. And then he also kind of went on to say, and we have our goaltending figured out. there's still going to be question marks. There's still going to be holes you got to fill. You got to, recoup some of that draft capital, as you were just saying. But, like, they are going into this summer feeling better about spots on the roster that they did not feel good about last summer. So that is significant as well. And they did touch on the fact that they are going to engage in some contract extension talks with Marty Netchis after July 1 and kind of start doing that due diligence as well. But I want to hit on the part that you talked about just now with Joe Sakic in particular, over and over saying this stings. This really stings. And he said that it stings differently than the last 2 seasons because they felt like they had a team that could win this year in the same way they did with 2022. You talked about scar tissue on yesterday's show, and Jared Bednar has talked about how losing to Vegas in 2021 changed them. And that was a loss that sat with folks for a long time, and that one really stung. Just based on the looks on their faces, the answers they gave, the honesty at which they spoke with Meghan, to me, I think there's a world where this type of loss has a similar impact on the organization where it's like, well, we're not going to feel this way again.
The title defense season, there were some struggles in season, a lot of injuries. I remember there was a period where Mikko Rantanen was kind of carrying that team on its back. And so in season, there was a lot of question of where can this group go? Can they compete for another this year? They're kind of hanging together by rubber bands and glue. And Jared Bednar would talk about how the motivation after you've won the cup does come from a different place than the motivation like the sting of the Vegas loss was able to propel them to their Stanley Cup. That you have to dig a little deeper in somewhere different than once you've won it. And it seemed like that was something the players were adjusting to and learning because every professional athlete is highly motivated. It's just a different level of motivation to want the Stanley Cup enough. And I think, Dallas showed a lot of that hunger and desperation in the series, right? And so it makes me feel like it's similar to those comments that Jared Bednar made in the title defense season, that this team did need to draw upon motivation from an entirely new source, and this feels like that source because of the gravity of the sting that it's going to leave.
Yeah. Meghan, was there anything else that overwhelmingly stood out to you in terms of their comments, maybe their thought process on things? There wasn't anything that really caught me off guard by what they said. I wasn't surprised by anything. Was there anything else that stuck out to you overwhelmingly?
Overwhelming is maybe dramatic, but there are things that stick out to me. So when he's talking about Marty Netchis, right, like a player that has another year here, but all right, are you going to start extension talks? He also mentions Parker Kelly. And so I thought that was interesting because there are other players in this boat, but he specifically, front of mind, Parker Kelly is there. And so it was actually someone I even thought about asking, but there just aren't enough questions that you're allotted in these types of settings.
We went for almost 30 minutes, did you know that?
Yeah, they were really generous, and we each got to ask at least 2 questions, which is very generous. And so if this had been a totally open forum, just me sitting with Chris MacFarland and Joe for fun having conversations, I would have asked about Parker Kelly. And so I do think this is a player that exceeded expectation.
Meghan Angley asking about Parker Kelly for fun.
Hey guys, we'll just meet for coffee and talk about Parker Kelly. I think the year that he had exceeded expectation, and he was such a good fit in Colorado.
Yeah.
It won't surprise me, and it's not going to be this newsworthy headline, but I think that he's someone that they want around the organization for longer. And again, I know that's not entirely newsworthy, but it did stand out to me that just among all the names that he could have said there and talking about extension talks like Jonathan Drouin, Parker Kelly.
Well, and Meghan, it is funny as we wind this down here. They specifically called out the fourth line. You've called out the fourth line here. Like, as you're trying to rebuild something close to this for next year, why not lock in that fourth line and say, perfect, fourth line, set and forget? Because if you're having to make tweaks to your third line, maybe find another center that you can, fill in, well, that's a much less daunting task than what they had to do in terms of a total overhaul for this year. So I'm being tongue-in-cheek, giving you a hard time about Parker Kelly for fun. But like, I do think that's not insignificant that he called him out, because to me that does say like, okay, we want to have as much set going into next year as possible. Like, they didn't talk about like how much turnover. I guess Joe Sakic did say at the beginning, like a lot of turnover, a lot of new faces.
Yes.
But that to me, them including Parker Kelly, is them saying like, we don't want to do this again next year. We don't want to be having to dig into free agency or trade pools or whatever to try to find top pieces, depth pieces, defense, goal. Like, no, let's minimize the chaos. And I think mentioning Parker Kelly is not insignificant.
I wanted to throw some numbers at people around Mackenzie Blackwood's performance too. I've seen people feel like he didn't come up with the saves in the big moments. And I think if you really look at the context of the series game by game, goal by goal, I don't think that's really fair.
I agree.
There's a couple, honestly, at least 3 at the top of my brain, weird ones that you just don't hang on Mackenzie Blackwood. And so the numbers do reflect that of the goaltenders, and these are numbers as of yesterday before additional hockey was played. Among the goaltenders, he did give up some of the most rebounds. You could see that with the eye test, that this is maybe an area of his game that could stand to improve. But when it comes to the grade A's and the high danger chances, he had a better high danger save percentage than Jake Ottinger, who faced the most high danger chances of any goaltender as of yesterday. Because in terms of how the Avs were creating, they were putting a lot of pucks on net to include quality chances. It just wasn't translating, right? So it's a testament to what Jake Ottinger did well, but also Mackenzie Blackwood still faced the 4th most high danger chances and had, the 3rd most expected goals against. And the rush attempts were pretty similar either way, with Colorado coming ahead in creating more rush attempts that both goaltenders had to come up with saves. And to that note, it was still among the highest of any series coming out of the first round. And so the rebound thing may be an issue, but the high danger save percentage, I think, deserves more of a shout out that he was coming up with big saves. And I'm not even going to say he made him look easy, but to some extent he did. And so I don't want that to get lost in the narrative around Mackenzie Blackwood's playoff performance if anyone has any doubt that this is their starting goaltender moving forward.
Yeah, I'm with you. And their tandem is set for next year. We're going to give our final thoughts here in just a moment. I do want to remind you guys about our great partners over at Accurate America. You never know when and where the hail will hit when the summer storms come. We got a summer storm. I know it's technically spring still. We got a summer storm rolling in today. It's going to be here all week. And the last thing you want is to be caught scrambling when the storms do roll in. So make sure you call before the storm. Call Accurate America, 303-900-ROOF. They'll partner with you on navigating insurance, provide quick, professional, and knowledgeable service using the latest technology and 3D modeling. And their work is guaranteed for as long as you own the home. That's my favorite part of it. I always have to call that out. I think that's such a cool thing to do. They come out and work on it now. If you're in that house 20 years later, they are going to guarantee that work. Don't scramble at the last minute. Call Accurate America, 303-900-ROOF. And Megan, make sure you call before the storm. Megan, final thoughts for you on what we heard today. I'm sure as you and I go back and re-listen to things, we'll have more to talk about and dissect here later in the week. We'll have plenty of clips going out talking about all this as well. But just kind of your final thoughts for today on what we heard from Joe and C-Mac.
There's kind of 2 things I want to make mention of. One, that there are so many specific topics that we have set aside to talk about with respect to this series that we haven't even gotten to yet. And so when I say that the Avs are analytically the better team 5 of 7 games, I mean in all situations, but we haven't had our special teams conversation. And so I want to put a big asterisk by that for a reason, because they were such a dominant 5v5 team. Obviously, they came away ahead in the 5v5 numbers, most shots for, highest Corsi for percentage, fewest shots against, highest expected goals, and most high danger chances for at 5v5. But because those numbers were so strong, that also is true in all situations. However, this is why analytics need to be used responsibly and why saying they're analytically better is an important qualifier, because obviously results-based, they weren't the better team.
Right.
And that's because we haven't gotten into our special teams conversation. So obviously, moving on from Ray Bennett.
Yeah, and that was why we wanted to wait on the special teams conversation, just for the record, is we had a feeling this was coming, and we wanted to be able to wait to see how that all shook out before we dug into that. Sorry.
Yeah. that was a necessary change because of how much the power play impacted this series, as we talked about. And so stay tuned for our penalty kill conversation, because Nolan Pratt is still a member of the Avs organization, and we have a lot of thoughts about the penalty kill over this series that you might hate, you might surprise you, but it is something to talk about because it's an area that, Dallas had a lethal power play. So we do need to examine the kill coming out of the series.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, Megan, my thoughts coming out of this one today is that this is a group who is not saying, well, I guess we'll tear it down. I guess we're going to go back to the drawing board and start over. Someone even kind of half floated out tearing it down. And Chris MacFarland goes, what do you mean tearing it down?
If we could run it back, we would.
We would. So this is a team that is, for as much as they push their chips to the middle this year, with whatever chips they've got left, they are going to do it again next year. This seems like a group that this is not just going to be an, oh, well, we lost, let's get our tee time scheduled and get back at her next year. Like, to me, I think Chris MacFarland might take a couple days to make sure that he's in the right headspace, but he is probably getting back to work like yesterday.
Oh my God, I imagine he hasn't slept very much.
No, and the sleep he's gotten, I'm sure it has not been great sleep.
Mikko Rantanen's in his nightmares.
I know, and I guess we'll leave it with this. I did ask about that. I said, Joe, you keep mentioning how much it stung. Is there a level that's because Mikko's on the other side? And he was like, no. This has nothing to do with Mikko Rantanen being on the other side. We felt we had a good enough team to win, and we didn't. That's the sting. And so, like I said, if for any of the Avs fans out there that were hoping that they would come out and say, we're firing everyone, we're tearing it down, we're rebuilding, we're starting over, that is just not going to be what happens here, and expect an aggressive summer and into next season from this front office. I'm dropping stuff. We're throwing things at each other at this point. I think it's time to get out of here. That's going to do it. She's Meghan Angley. I'm Jesse Montano. Got Mark just making all this happen for the last month. We don't give enough love to our folks behind the scene making all this happen. So big thanks to Mark for today making all this happen. Check out the full-length Chris MacFarland, Joe Sakic presser available on Grill Sports, and we're going to have all kinds of clips going out to come along with this pod. But that's going to do it. We'll be back at it. We got a Pucks and Prosecco this week that we may just kind of commandeer for more of this conversation, or we might even add another episode in. There's still a lot to unpack.
PPP. Playoff, Pucks, Prosecco.
We don't want to be talking about this series for the next month. We will move on from it eventually, but Megan, given where this team is at in their competitive window, the moves they made, the personnel that was on the roster, all of that, there is just so much to unpack, and you and I want to make sure that we give all of it the air that it needs. So that's going to do it. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll be back at it here later this week. More content coming. Jared Bednar locked in as the Avs head coach for next year. Ray Bennett on the outs. The Avs are officially looking for a new associate coach. Thanks so much for hanging out, guys.